Hi, that was the middle 4 bars of Twinkle Twinkle Little Stars, with the second 2 bars being harmonised in a different way to the first 2. So this is lesson 2 in my series Jazz Reharmonisation. If you haven't seen lesson 1 yet, there's a link in the description below. There's also a PDF available for this lesson with all the examples in this lesson in all 12 keys, and the link for the PDF is also in the description below. In lesson 1, I explained and demonstrated how you can use ninths on dominant 7th chords. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how you can also add ninths to major and minor chords, and also some alter notes to dominant 7th chords. I'm also going to show you how you can use flat and fifth or tritone substitutions, and finally how to use suspensions. Let's have another look now at the first 4 bars of Twinkle Twinkle and see where I can add ninths to the major and minor chords. In the final reharmonisation in lesson 1, this is what I played. By the way, adding ninths and altered notes is not strictly speaking reharmonisation because we're not actually altering the chord, but it is a good way of adding colour and tension to the harmony. So let's have another look at the first 4 bars of Twinkle and see where we can put ninths in on the major and minor chords. If you remember in lesson 1, we already put them in on the dominant chords. So it begins with C6. But the melody note is C. Now, there's a problem there because the ninth of a C major chord is D. It's a tone above the root note C. It comes from the C major scale, just like the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and either the 6th or the 7th come from the C major scale. So does the ninth, D. If you counted up 9 letter names from C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you'd land on D. Much easier though just to think a tone up from the root. So really the problem on the first note is there's nowhere to put that ninth. If you tried to stick it down there, or even putting the root down an octave lower, it sounds pretty muddy. So for the time being, we've no option really, but just to leave that out like that. Let's look at G minor 7. Can we put a ninth in there? Well, first of all, remember that G minor 7 has a B flat in it. That's because it's borrowed from the key of F major. So the 3rd of the chord B flat comes from the F major scale. Now, in a minor 7th, the ninth is also a tone above the root. So that makes it A, and that comes from the scale of F major. So can we put that in? Well, if we put it just below the 3rd there, that gives it a nice little tense, colourful sound. Keep the ninth in on the C7. So now we get... About the D minor 7? Well, D minor 7 is from the key of C, and the ninth tone above the root is E. That will fit just below the 3rd there, so I can play it like that. When we get to C major 7, the ninth is D. Now the melody note this time is G, so that will go just nicely below the 3rd of C major. 2 options here when you go into A minor 7. Those 2 notes, the major 7th and the 9th, can both drop a step. So the 9th is going to the 3rd of A minor 7. The major 7th is going to the root. That gives nice inner voice leading. Or you could put the 9th in on the A minor 7. In other words, keep the B where it is and just move the D, and you would get this. So you would still get some movement, not quite as much, not the nice movement in thirds, but you would have the added bonus of the extra colour and tension there. Now we're on to the third bar with F in the melody on a D minor 7 chord. The ninth is E, and yes, that will go nicely below the melody like this. Keep the ninth in the G7. C major 7, E is the melody. So once again, yes, the ninth, that's D, will go nicely below that. And then we've got the same thing going to A minor 7. We can either move the major 7th and 9th down a step like that, which does give nice voice leading, or just move the D down to the C and keep the B as the 9th. Now when we get to the D minor 7, we haven't really got anywhere to put the 9th there. I think it's a bit too muddy to stick it down there. So just leave it out for the moment. Keep the 9th in the G7 chord and back to where we started. I also said that I was going to look at adding flattened 9ths to some of the dominant 7th chords. So what are flattened 9ths and how do they work? Let's look at G7. The 9th is A. The flattened 9th, as the name suggests, is A flat. It's simply a semitone below the 9th. Now you can use a flattened 9th on G7 in the key of C major. So how does that work? Because obviously the note A flat is not from the scale of C major. The thing is that G7 is the dominant 7th, both in the key of C major and C minor. So if we look at a C harmonic minor scale, it's got the note A flat in it, and that is the flattened 9th of a G7 chord. So basically you've borrowed the flattened 9th from the key of C minor. So let's have a look now at the dominant 7ths and see where we can use that. So let's start off C6. Now we put the 9th on the G minor 7. Now before I played C7 and I included the note D, the 9th. Let's see if we can use the flattened 9th. Yes, that's fine. It leads nicely now down to C, which is the 7th of D minor 7. So now obviously on the next melody note, A, we can't use a flattened 9th on that dominant 7th chord simply because the melody note is the 9th itself. So then we go back to the C major 7, and remember we've put the 9th in there now. Now we were going to A minor 7. There's something else we could do here. We could look at the D minor 7 at the beginning of the next bar and say, let's tonicize that. Let's approach it with its dominant 7th. Now that would be A7. So we would be going, instead of C major 7 to A minor 7, we could go to A7, and we could try putting a flattened 9th in there. So that's A7, that is the 9th, B, the flattened 9th is B flat. Let's try that. Now that works really well because the 7th of C major 7, that's B, and the 9th both drop a semitone. The 7th drops to the flattened 9th of A7, and the 9th drops to the 3rd. So now not only that, but when you then go on to D minor 7, they both drop another semitone. So the flattened 9th of A7, B flat, drops a semitone to the 5th of D minor 7. The 3rd of A7, C sharp, drops a semitone to the 7th of D minor 7. So you get this lovely inner voice movement in thirds going down chromatically. about the next chord, G7. We've been playing G9 there, which works fine. We could put the flat ninth instead, like this. Now it gives a kind of darker sound. The ninth is fine, the flat ninth is fine. And the flat ninth does give that nice little voice leading though down to the 5th of C major 7. And then once again at the end of this bar you can do the same thing with the A minor 7. You can change it into A7 with a flat 9, so that once again you've got that lovely inner voice leading. Now when we get to the D minor 7, we've already said there's no room really there for a 9. But the G7, we put the ninth in there, that's fine. We could put the flat ninth in there. So I'm going to play those first 4 bars again, putting these flat ninths in on the dominant 7th chord. Remember, you can't put one there. Let's look now at the middle 4 bars of Twinkle Twinkle. I played these 4 bars in the introduction, and for the first 2 of those 4 bars I played exactly the same harmonies that I played in the final harmonisation in lesson 1. On the 3rd and 4th though, I introduced what we call flat and 5th or tritone substitute chords. So let's just look at the first 2 first of all. I played C major 7, A minor 7, D minor 7, G9, C major 7, A minor 7, D minor 7, G9. So before we go on to the 3rd and 4th bars with the flat and 5th substitutes, let's just look at ways that we can make these chords slightly more colourful. And we can do what we've been doing on the first line, that's adding ninths on the major and minor chords and flattened ninths on the dominant 7th chords. So on the C major 7 chord, we can put D, which is the 9th, just below the 3rd E. On the A minor 7, we can do exactly the same thing, put B, the 9th, just below C, the 3rd. The same thing on D minor 7, the 9th is E, goes just under the melody note F. On the G7, instead of going to the 9th, we can lower the 9th a semitone to make it the flat 9th. On the next C major 7, again, put the 9th in just below the melody note E, which is the 3rd. A minor 7, put the 9th in just below the 3rd. On the D minor 7, there isn't really anywhere for the 9th to go. But on the G7, instead of going to the 9th A, we can have the flattened 9th. Another thing that we could do in those 2 bars is tonicize both of the D minor 7 chords by changing the A minor 7 chords that come just before them into A7. And also we could put the flattened 9th on these A7 chords. So that would sound like this. Now that works really well because of this inner movement that I talked about earlier on the major 7th chord, C major 7, the 7th and the 9th drop a semitone to the flattened 9th and 3rd of A7. They then drop a semitone to the 5th and 7th of D minor 7 and another semitone to the flattened 9th of G7. So let's just look at that with the melody. And look at these inner notes. We can do the same thing in the 2nd bar. Let's look now at the third and fourth of those middle four bars. Now, before we talk about the flat and fifth or tritone substitutes, you may have noticed that instead of playing the C major 7, I played E minor 7. So why is that? Why can we do that? Well, if you look at the notes of an E minor chord, it's like A minor in that it contains two notes that C major contains, the E and the G. Now, if you add a seventh onto E minor, make it E minor 7, and then put C below it, you've actually got a C major 9 chord. So whenever you get a tonic chord, going to chord 6, so in the QC that's C going to A minor 7, it's often a good idea to substitute chord 1 with chord 3, E minor 7. From the E minor 7 chord, you can carry on to either the A minor 9 or to the A7 with the flattened ninth as before. So either or. However, what I did in the introduction was to use what we call a flattened fifth or tritone substitute. Instead of playing A7, I played E flat 7. So, what is a flattened fifth substitute and why does it work? Well, let's look first of all just at a G7 chord. The fifth of a G7 chord is the note D. If I flatten it, make it D flat, and then on that note build another dominant seventh chord, a D flat 7 chord, we can often substitute a D flat 7 chord for a G7 chord. We call it a flattened fifth substitute because the root of the D flat 7 is a flattened fifth above the root of G7. It's called a tritone substitute because a flattened fifth is a tritone, 3 tones. That's 1 tone, 2, 3 tones. Now, it seems a bit odd. Why on earth would a D flat 7 chord, which looks nothing like a G7 chord, work? Well, it's to do with these two notes, the third and the seventh of G7. When you play just those two notes on their own, you feel a discord, you feel a tension which wants to resolve like this. So you get tension and resolution. Now that interval is a diminished fifth interval. You can also call that a tritone because it's 3 tones. 1, 2, 3. Let's look at the third and the seventh of a D flat 7 chord. That's the third and that's the seventh. Now, if you take that note and put it down there, you'll notice that it's actually the same two notes. Spelt differently, but the same two notes. Now, if you were resolving a D flat 7 chord, you would normally be going to a G flat chord. So, to keep it simple, you would do either that, or if the seventh and the third were played there, they would resolve outwards like that. Now, because you've got that same tritone in a D flat 7 chord, you can play it as a substitute for G7, and these two notes can resolve not to G flat but to a C chord. So you could resolve it like this, or outwards like that. So what I played in the introduction was I played the E minor 7 first, and then instead of playing A7, I played E flat 7. Now the fifth of A7 is E, the flattened fifth is E flat. So if we build a flattened fifth, a dominant seventh on E flat, we can use an E flat 7 chord as a flattened fifth substitute for A7. So let's have a look at that, see how it works. Now I'm putting the flattened ninth in as well. That's E flat 7, that's the 9th, that's the flat 9th. I'm going to play the root down there, sounds a little bit richer. And that leads us nicely to the D minor 9 chord. Now from the D minor 9 chord we've been going to G7 with a flattened 5th. However, we could use a flattened 5th substitute for G7. There's G7. If I flatten the 5th, D, make it D flat, build a dominant 7th on D flat, get a D flat 7 chord. So I'm going to use a D flat 7 chord in place of the G7. So let's have a look how that works. Here's the E minor 7, going to E flat 7 with a flat 9th, going to D minor with the 9th in. Now I'm going to play D flat 7, but I'm also going to put in the flat 9th. That is the flat 9th. That's D flat 7, that is the 9th, that is the flat 9th. So we get, now that works really well. You've got this nice chromatic movement in the bass going down in semitones, and you've got very smooth voice leading. Each of the notes of each of these chords either stays in the same place when it changes to the next chord, or it moves to the nearest note in the next chord. Let's just simplify these chords and have a look at that. So for the E minor 7, got the root, the 7th, the 3rd. Now on the E flat 7 chord, the melody note is the same, G, so the 3rd of E minor 7 becomes the 3rd of E flat 7. The 7th drops to the 7th, and the root drops to the root. So you've got one note staying in the same place, the other two just moving down a semitone. When you go to D minor 7, everything goes down a step there. So 3rd to 3rd, 7th to 7th, root to root. When we go from D minor 7 to D flat 7, the 3rd of D minor 7 stays in the same place, becomes the 3rd of D flat 7. The 7th drops a semitone to the 7th of D flat 7. And then when we go from there to C major 7, the 3rd of D flat 7 drops a step to the 3rd of C major 7. The 7th stays in the same place and becomes the 7th of C major 7, and the root drops a semitone. Also, let's just have a look at the movement of the 9th in these chords. Now, first of all, on the E minor 7, if I put another root in just there, when we change to E flat 7, I can keep that in the same place and it becomes the flat 9th, and then keep it in the same place and it becomes the 9th of D minor 7. And then when we go to D flat 7 with a flat 9th, it drops down a step. And then it stays in the same place and becomes the 9th of C major 9. So once again, you've got very smooth voice leading. Now, in the introduction, after the C minor 9 chord, I didn't go to either the A minor 9 chord or the A7 with the flat 9. Instead, I went to this chord and then to this. So first of all, what is this chord? It's quite a harsh sounding chord. It's got a lot of tension in. Well, it's an A flat 7 with two what we call altered notes. Now, there are 4 possible altered notes that you can use on dominant 7th chords. One of them is the flattened 9th, which we've already talked about a lot in this lesson. The next one is the sharpened 9th. So if you take a G7 chord, A is the 9th, flatten it, you get the flat 9th, sharpen it, you get the sharpened 9th. A very harsh sounding chord. The next altered note that you can use is the flattened fifth. So D is the fifth, you can have D flat instead of the D. And then the fourth altered note is the flattened 13th. Now, as well as ninths, you can have 11ths and 13ths. If you count up 11 letter names from the root, you find an 11th, and 13 letter names, a 13th. A 13th, by the way, is the same as a 6th, but it's just, if you're counting from that G up 13, you get to that E up there, which is 13. If you count up 6, you get there. But for some reason, we tend to call that, on a dominant 7th chord, a 13th. On an ordinary major chord, we call it a 6th. So on a G7 chord, the 13th would be E. If you flatten it, you get the flattened 13th. By the way, you very often get the flattened 13th and the flattened 9th at the same time. So on a G7, if we have the 9th there, the 13th there, and flatten them both, you get a G7 with a flattened 9th, flattened 13th. Now, that's the chord that I played just here. A flat 7 with a flattened 9th and a flattened 13th. Flattened, the 13th of A flat 7 is F. Lower it to semitone, you get the flattened 13th. So why then have I chosen that chord instead of either A7 with a flattened 9th or its flattened fifth substitute, which would have been E flat 7 with a flat 9, to then take me to D minor 7? Well, it's because I'm not actually going to D minor 7 this time. I'm going to this chord. So really, to explain why I've chosen that one, I need to explain about the chord we're going to, which is this one. Now, this is an example of what we call a suspended chord. If you look at the top notes, let's take that D and put it down there. That's actually a D minor 7 chord, but we've got G in the bass. Now, when you go from a D minor 7 chord to a G7 chord, let's just have a look at that. Let's say, do it like that. I'll forget the 9th for the moment on the G7. Just go to an ordinary G7. Let's look what's happening. First of all, the 7th of D minor 7 is dropping a semitone to the 3rd of G7. The 5th of D minor 7, A, is dropping a step to the root of G7. Now, in a suspension, what you do is, instead of going to the notes in the next chord, you keep those notes down for a moment like this. So we say that these notes here, instead of going where they're expected to go to, where it feels like you need them to go to, they are suspended. And you get this lovely sort of feeling of tension there, but it's a very pleasant sound, which then resolves. Now, it sounds much more colourful if instead of the 5th of D minor 7 going to the root G7, it drops a semitone to the flat 9th of G7. So that's what I did at the end of this middle 4 bars. I put the suspension in there, so that this chord, the A flat 7 with the 2 altered notes, it's another flattened fifth substitute. The fact that I'm not substituting it for a D chord is not really important. The point is, it's where I'm going to the G chord with the suspension. So I'm playing a dominant 7th, a semitone above it, and then going on to the suspension. Now, you've got this lovely inner movement here, Once again, thirds going down a semitone. And that is something that is used in jazz, particularly in ballads, ever such a lot to create movement. Okay, so that has now covered the use of ninths on major and minor seventh chords, the use of two of the altered notes that you can use on dominant seventh, that's the flat and ninth and the flat and 13th, the use of flat and fifth substitute chords or tritone substitute chords, and finally the use of suspensions. Now, for the time being, we're still going to leave the last four bars harmonised the same as the first four, just with one little tweak, and that is the first bar. If you remember at the beginning, we said the melody note is C, it's harmonised with a C6 chord, and we can't really put a ninth in there because there's nowhere for it to go, which leaves that chord feeling a little bit kind of vanilla compared to the rest of them. What we can do there though is change it to A minor 7, and we can put the ninth in there just below the melody. That sounds fine. And if we then go to the A flat 7, a flat and fifth substitute with a ninth in to take us to the G minor 7, that sounds great. Okay, hope you found this lesson useful again. If you did and you haven't done so far, I'd be really glad if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe. And I'm also always happy to see any comments that you may have, or ask any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. Don't forget that there is a PDF available, and the link for that is in the description below. In the next video in this series, I will be talking about some contemporary chord substitutions and chord voicings, and also about how to stylize this a little bit, using things like the walking bass that I played in lesson 1. Thank you. See you in the next video.